me just take one more look. Okay, so it says we are live streaming. Okay, so I'll get started. I'm Kevin Freeman, and today I have a welcome to York History Group, and we're glad that so many members have joined up. Kevin McKinney and I are very pleased, and we're very excited. And today is our first live event, and I have two great guests, Danny Bottino, who many of you might know from Old York and other places. He's been a fixture at Old York for many, many years, I understand. And he's an amazing historian, and he's currently pursuing a PhD at Rutgers in early English, I think, in colonial America.
Yes.
Yeah, and so we're really grateful to have you here today, Danny, to talk about one of the headstones in the cemetery where I know that you give a lot of tours. And we also have James Kences, who is known by probably everybody in York as York's probably close to premier historian, who is an amazing book of knowledge. And James, we're also really pleased to have you here today. And I just want to say too that James has an article in this past week's York Weekly on the topic that we're going to be discussing today. And James does an article in the York Weekly, I think once a month usually. And
yep, once a month.
Yeah, and this segment is going to kind of like echo James' article, and we're going to kind of diverge from it at times, probably, knowing the way that our conversations seem to go. We're all very enthusiastic, and so I'm going to ask Danny to start off with telling us a little bit about his experience when he gives a tour of Mary Nasson's headstone. What kind of like the reaction is, or what what their expectations are, and just kind of an in general observation.
Yes, that's a good question. Definitely, I've been giving guided tours there, really, since this start of this current summer season. I believe we gave the first walking tours in May. We were trying to figure out, since our buildings have been totally closed, we wanted to keep, some sort of history going, and so we created these walking tours. And I've been giving the burial ground tour, and certainly I would say that the most well-known stone in the burial ground is Mary Nasson's, or Nasson. Maybe it's there's two S's, right? So it may be Mary Nasson or Mary Nasson, and her stone there certainly stands out. Just if you're looking at it, even if you don't know anything, even if you hadn't heard the legends or known much about the history of the people buried there, if you're just passing by, you would see her, right? You would see that she's the only stone with the large slab over her. And then if you come in to look at her grave more closely, you would see, if you look at the other stones, you would see that she's the only one with a portrait of her on it, what we call portrait stones. And if you look at all the other stones, none of them have portraits of the people buried there. So simply looking at that, even if you don't know anything, you would think, okay, there's something different here. Now, of course, most people who come in to look at the burial ground, to look at her grave, do come there for certain reasons. I would say that there is the popular legend, right, which is that she was some sort of magical person, a witch, or exorcist. I've even seen it claimed, which is even stranger if you know the history of the time period. So this legend is told that the slab is there, keep her ghost from rising to practice her evil, her dangerous magic. And so that's the legend in its earliest form. It was written in a book, A History of York, Maine, by a man named Emery in the 1870s. Mm-hmm. And this is the legend that is still current nowadays. If you go to Google, just type in York Mary Nasson, which is grave. These are variants of the legends many of them will come. So that's why people come.
Danny, let me interrupt for a second.
Yeah.
I just want to say that the old burying ground that we're talking about is on Lindsay Road in York Village, Maine. And it's right across from Jeffers Tavern on one side, and it's kind of across from the old jail on the other side, just so people know exactly where we're talking about.
Definitely, yes. And so I'll finish up my answer here. And then we'll let James, if he wants to add into that. So, you know, these people, as you were saying, right, they don't not only visit the grave, but they certainly, if you go there, you'll see that quite a few objects are left there. And we can't know, you know, why each person leaves anything, right? I would think everyone has a slightly different purpose. And there are other objects that are left at other people's stones also, much fewer numbers. I would think family members mostly. But her stone, of course, is the only one where you have large numbers of non-family members. People just know the story or the legend. And so they come and leave these coins and other objects there.
Yeah, wow. So James, I know that your article this week in the York Weekly kind of wants to debunk the myth of Mary Nasson being affiliated with witchcraft. So what do you think the harm of it is that currently she is associated as maybe being a witch?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, you can? Oh, good. Okay, good. All right. Well, what's important to realize is over the past 2 decades, the tendency towards reaction has increased. Early on, there just wasn't that awareness, special awareness about the grave. It has increased in the past few years and has grown. With each year, it has become more evident that there's been that kind of response. My fear is, of course, that that attention can contribute towards abuse of various kinds. I heard some individuals talking about taking a gravestone rubbing of the grave the other day, and I don't encourage people to take gravestone rubbings. They unfortunately can, depending on the type of gravestone, especially if slate gravestones, can result in fragmenting of the frontal portion that can break off into plates. So the pressure of the gravestone rubbing and the use of adhesive to the surface can be damaging to the stone. So that certainly is something. And just the what I've observed, you know, among the small children, the 5th graders, taken into the burial ground as part of the living history program, they tend to be, you know, very abusive to the grave site. And just in my own personal experience, there has been erosion to that grave site and that gravestone, right? And it used to be close to pristine at one time, and it's no longer that way.
Yeah. Danny, can you talk a little bit about Mary Nasson and what we know about her, and how that it would be very unlikely that she would have had any connection to being a witch?
Definitely, yes. And I would say, James probably knows some facts I'll be leaving out here, so he can come in if I leave something out, right? But you know, I always say when I'm giving my general burial ground tour, which her grave is one of the stops on the tour, is that most of what we know about her, about Mary Nasson, can be the primary source for that is the actual grave, is the actual physical is the actual physical gravestone and the slab over it, and her footstone also, which has been broken, but it is still present. It is currently in storage, so hopefully that will be fixed. And so really for Mary Nasson, that's almost all that we know about her life, and we can glean the fact that she died in 1774. She was a mother, I believe, to 4 children, and she was married to Samuel Nasson, and she was 29 when she died. And there's a few more facts that we can glean from the town records and other sources, not on Mary Nasson, but having to do with her husband, Samuel Nasson. I think James can fill us in on some of those facts there, which do give us a slightly wider view of this family here in York in the 1760s and 1770s. So that's all we really, the facts that we have about the real lives of Mary and her husband are somewhat limited. And so you mentioned the witch legend, right? So if we think about the witch trials in this period and why some people were labeled as witches, and in the most serious cases brought to trial and then hanged for the capital crime of witchcraft. The basic outlines of the history is that the most famous and indeed the most deadly witch trials were the famous Salem Trials of 1692. Note 1692, right? And those were basically the final trials. The last trials were a few years later, much smaller in 1697. And so thinking about that, Mary Nasson died in 1774, almost 100 years after the 1692 trials. So if you're thinking about her, as a witch in the context of the legends of the history of the witch trials, she doesn't fit into that.
Yeah.
History. It's a completely different time period. It isn't to say that there were certainly people in York in the 1770s throughout the region who still held on to the cultural views of witches as dangerous people who had sold their souls to Satan. Basically, that's the simple version of what who a witch was.
Would those people be considered anti-Puritanism? Anti-Puritanists?
I would say that those people, like Jonathan Sayward being one of them, that we know because he told that to John Adams as he traveled through York in 1774. And Adams tells this to us in his diary. Those people would not have been anti-Puritan. I would say rather they were perhaps the more sort of old-fashioned Puritan sect. Puritans, is a somewhat vague term, and Puritans were really basically gone by the 1770s. But
yeah,
Puritans, like the stereotype of a Puritan would be York's minister Samuel Moody, right? He died in 1747. If anyone was an actual Puritan person, it would be Samuel Moody. And Sayward went to church, Jonathan Sayward, and heard Samuel Moody's sermons for 30 years. Yeah. He looked up to Samuel Moody. So Sayward still had that old Puritan spirit, I would certainly say.
So James, would witches thrown back to like the witch trials that were still perpetuating witchery, would they have been living contemporaneously with Moody in the same community and interacting?
That's a really hard one to answer. Which, just to give you an example, in the 17th century, oftentimes to refer to someone as a witch would be an insult. And there would be, moments where there'd be confrontations over a number of issues that occurred with neighbors. And you'll see in the records where someone is referred to as a witch. Now, for the most part, the contemporary legal system never took them seriously. The vast majority of these episodes ended with them being thrown out of court because they just were not regarded as legitimate. 1692 stands out in not only the legitimacy that is given, but the full form of the legal process, because that's another aspect here. They can enter the legal process, but they never go through to trial or to execution in except rare cases.
Interesting. I'm going to try to bring up the epitaph.
Yes.
Where are we here? Share screen. And here we go. Can you guys see that?
Yep.
Yes, yeah.
Yeah. All right. I'm gonna. If you guys mind if I read it?
Oh,
Oh, sure, sure.
Okay. This is the epitaph that's on Mary Nasson's headstone. Here rests, quite free from life's distressing care, a loving wife, a tender parent dear, cut down in midst of days, as you may see. But stop, my grief, I soon shall be equal be, when death shall stop my breath and end my time. God grant my dust may mingle then with thine. And then it finishes with sacred to the memory of Mrs. Mary Nasson, wife of Samuel Nasson, who departed this life August 28th, 1774. So that's a very tender tribute to Samuel's wife right there.
yes.
Yeah. So, and I think I was talking to Danny last week about that there's no indication here that she had anything to do with being a witch. There's no evidence that reveals anything like that. It's mostly just an endeared, loving spouse that's being mourned. Yeah,
Yeah, definitely.
and so James, I was talking to you earlier too about Samuel. He gave no indication after Mary's passing that Mary was had any connection to being a witch, and that he moved on with Jotham Moulton, or he replaced him in the brigade or whatever.
No, he married his widow.
Okay.
He married Jotham Moulton's widow.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right. Well, Samuel Nasson doesn't appear very often in the town records. This happens sometimes where an individual is a resident of town, but he doesn't hold many town offices.
Mm-hmm.
As I said to you earlier, he did hold an office known as he was one of two individuals who was chosen as a warden. This is an annual town office that has never really been defined in terms of what the full responsibilities of that office were. He held that office, and then in March of 1775, just a month before the Lexington alarm, there was a town meeting, and at the town meeting, he receives a position as tithing man. And a tithing man is really the equivalent of a church police officer. So to me, somewhat, the contrast of the witch's reputation for Mary Nasson and the fact that he is given these offices, which seem to be legal, law enforcement offices, to me is somewhat of a humorous aspect to this.
Yeah. Yeah. Do you know where he was buried, James?
He migrated to Sanford,
Okay.
and he died. He's dead by 1800. His probate is approved by 1800, so he's dead by the very end of the 18th century.
And did he have more children with Moulton, the new wife?
I don't know that. I don't know a great deal about his life in Sanford, as aside from his being chosen as a delegate at the time of the ratifying convention in 1788, and he was one of those individuals who was in opposition to the Constitution being approved.
Okay. You want to add to that, Danny?
Well, we should mention that I believe his primary job, in New York, was a saddler.
He was a saddler. Yes, he was a saddler.
Yeah.
He was a saddler. And it should also be noted, it's very important because it sheds light on Mary Nasson's grave, and I'm sure Danny can concur on this. Mary Nasson is from New Hampshire. Her maiden name was Mary Shores, and she's from New Hampshire. Samuel Nasson, I wanted to find any kind of reference to Samuel Nasson in a number of sources, including sources I looked at in New Hampshire. He apparently held an apprenticeship as a young man in Portsmouth. And it's interesting because, and I'm sure Danny can talk about this as well, the gravestones that we see, the Mary Nasson gravestone that we see in the burying ground in New York is very similar in style to gravestones of a carver of the period before the Revolution who has gravestones in Portsmouth. Mm-hmm. They have a human likeness on them, and they have the cursive writing a verse similar to what Mary Nasson's gravestone is. And it's interesting that orientation to Portsmouth that, reveals something of the background of Mary Nasson being from New Hampshire.
Yes, I do think that James has hit on a critical point here. As I was saying earlier, in the York burial ground, for someone who's just looking at it casually, the stone really stands out. It does look different than all of the others currently extant stones. But as James says, in Portsmouth, you can find certainly stones that look very similar to this one, probably carved by the same family or same family of carvers. I believe that it is known that a member of the famous Lamson family of gravestone carvers carved both Mary Nasson stone and the similar stones that we see in the Portsmouth area. And there would probably be other stones if one were to look. I would guess probably farther south, Essex County and Boston might have similar stones too. But in New York, it's the only one. And it may be that Samuel Nasson and Mary Nasson, with their Portsmouth ties, would have wanted this carver here. And it may have been, somewhat distasteful. It may have been seen as breaking the pattern of the stones that you should, put in York's burial ground. It may have caused problems. There's no way of knowing for certain, but he may have been, Samuel Nasson, in putting this stone up here, may have been breaking some social mores.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so this would exclude any hint of religion, I presume. This isn't like evocative of any religious figure, like an urn might be of a Greek urn, or
Right.
It's so it's kind of way out of context in regards to, so
That's right.
Yeah, it's very much. I mean, if you look at stones, contemporary gravestones in the burying ground, they are of the most conservative motif of the colonial period, the famous death's head or winged skull. So that continued right up beyond the Revolution into the early 1780s. So this one stands out really quite striking.
Wow.
Contrast.
Yeah. And I'm assuming you guys are seeing on the screen her headstone here.
Yes, and as you can see in that photograph, that photograph points out just how much damage the stone has been subjected to. That entire top portion is now broken, so that band, that marginal band, is broken into.
Yeah, that's really tragic. That's very sad.
Because people have actually been pounding on the top of it. People have been hitting it, and people have seen people kicking it as well.
Yeah, so this begs to address the deeper question about history, how history is conveyed, and how it can be misconstrued and have an entirely different, and have an interpretation that sort of takes off and has its own life and becomes like an urban legend. And I know that you both are very concerned about that. And how do we counter that? How do we make sure that people have a better understanding of the history of this, and then they're less, I'm going to scroll down to the back view here.
Yep.
And how do we assure that people have the right story in the first place and aren't like swept away by this myth?
Mm-hmm. We just have to put the true facts as we know them out there, and that's what we're doing here, certainly. So I've been trying to do this this whole summer season with my burial ground tours. And I know James has been doing this for many years prior to me, especially with the York School's living history program, right? Yeah. So it's simply whenever we James and I want to share the history as we know it, right? So it's simply a means of trying to talk to as many people as possible. And certainly the fact that so many people visit her stone here means that these people are fascinated by her burial and her story and who she was. And so I would think that almost everyone who visits her stone and leaves these monuments here and maybe really thinks that the legend is true and that she was some sort of witch, I would think that almost all these people would be happy to know the real history, and I would be happy to tell them.
Yeah. Have either of you encountered somebody that claims to be her ancestor?
I've not. No.
No, I've never encountered anyone who's claimed to be your ancestor. No, no.
So this is the back of the stone, and this is the horizontal stone that's on the ground. And James, can you tell us a little bit about why you think that that stone was placed there and the other stones are not similar?
Well, so there is a representation of the burying ground, a rather primitive representation of the burying ground that features similar stones to these among the gravestones in the burying ground, suggesting that this is one of those that survived. I don't know if that representation is an accurate one by any means. It seems to be highly embellished. I think I had said this some time ago, and I think there's some truth to it. There's a contemporary Georgian tendency to this gravestone that really points out the contrast between the existing gravestones in the burying ground and a style like this. One of the ways of trying to envision this is that Samuel Nasson may have had a far more worldly view than the other residents in town. I mean, he was a saddler, which means more than likely what he is selling in his shop is English horse furnishings. He's highly tied to England in terms of his business. He has a sort of worldly outlook that the others may have not shared.
Mm-hmm.
And I made this observation some time ago. I still think this resembles somewhat of the type of a configuration that you might find in an English churchyard over what you might find in an 18th century New England burial ground.
Yes, definitely.
That's an interesting theory. I I like that. But so you have no tangible evidence of that.
No, I don't. But I've observed. It's quite interesting. I was working on the town of Sudbury back in the 80s, and I saw that what was very interesting was that in Sudbury there was a very small minority of individuals who were using English children's names of the period that were very much in contrast to the typical names that children were being given, while the vast majority of children in Sudbury were being given biblical names. A very small minority were given names that were very suggestive of contemporary England.
Mm-hmm.
And I think even with the likeness that's on that gravestone is, very, very likely it's derived from some kind of a contemporary English engraving. If people think that this is a likeness of her in any way in like a photographic image, I think that would be very misleading. It's the same way that Paul Revere was deriving much of his engravings from English sources for the Revolution.
Yeah.
Oh yeah.
Huh.
And I would also add one more thing about the slab there, is that the most common theory, as I've heard it, is that Samuel Nasson ordered the slab to be put there to keep animals from digging the freshly buried body up. And these types of stones then are often called wolf stones, to keep wolves from digging people's bodies up. By the 1770s, York would probably still have had some wolves, but they were probably mostly gone. James has been studying this actually. So
yeah, actually I have been looking at the town records to see the decline of references to wolves in the constable's book.
Were there still wolves in the 1770s?
There is a very significant, I don't know the full explanation for why that is, but there's a very significant decline in the references to wolves in the constable's book by the time of the Revolution. So
They're being hunted.
The animals that are referred to in the constable's book are wildcats, bears, and wolves. there was an annual, in the town meeting, so much money was allocated as a bounty paid for those who killed wolves. A 3-pound bounty for those who killed wolves. And by the time of the Revolution, that really would not have been as significant as it would be decades earlier.
Oh yeah, so there may not have been wolves still in the center of York Village, but there certainly would have been other.
Yes, and in the town, in the church records, in the first parish church records, there are indications that there were actually livestock in the burial ground.
Yes.
Right, but that's earlier than this. That's decades earlier than this.
Right, but I did find something fascinating, which is that the man who lived in the current house, which is at the corner of the burial ground, which is the Emerson Wilcox house, and early 1800s, the person who owned the house was a man named Bulkley Emerson. And if you look at the town records, it's noted that he had a pig sty, which the church claimed was taking up too much area in the church's burial ground. So there was some controversy over that. So if Bulkley Emerson had his pigs in the burial ground in the early 1800s, you would have thought that his father Edward, who moved into that house in the 1750s, I think it was, it very probably would have had pigs and other maybe cows, maybe cattle, maybe other possible threats to digging up people's bodies from the 1750s onwards. So Samuel Nason would have noticed this certainly, and very probably put that stone over her there to keep her.
And that might be why that she was more isolated from the other stones as well.
That's a good thought there too. He may have wanted to keep her farther from where he saw the pigs roaming.
Yeah. And I also wanted to add that in Ralph Wynn's Legends of Cape Medic book, it's totally anecdotal, no primary sources at all, but that I know of. But there was somebody going from like Cape Medic to a Gunkwit, and they were accosted by a bunch of wolves, and he was in a cart, and he fended them off all night. They kept Ralph explains that they kept circling around the man's cart, and I think the guy actually survived. And I think that was during Ralph's lifetime, which was probably early 1900s.
Oh, that's interesting. That's interesting.
Yeah. There were still some wolves out there. Some people claim there's still wolves there now.
Yeah.
Yes.
We do have a lot of coyotes.
Right. Yeah.
Before the Revolution, I mean, the decade before the Revolution, beginning in 1765, there's something called, it's a reaction against, it's very important to understand how dependent funerals of this period were upon English imports for the funerary items like gloves and the various funerary items. By the 1765, largely about the time of the Stamp Act, there's something increasingly called an American funeral, where they deliberately avoid any English imports as part of the funerary practice. And it points out something, I think, that it points out a strong reaction at the level of what they regard as such a fundamental ceremony as the funerary ceremony. And this has to be thought of in terms of the funerary practice that underlies the grave of Mary in 1774, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
And if 1774 was a pretty big, year for, just
an American funeral.
American colonies.
These American funerals would include only items that this was a period from the 1760s, increasing reliance upon manufactured items that were produced in the colonies versus those that were imported from England. And there's, the funeral is certainly a reflection of the attitudes of resistance against Great Britain.
Right. And, it certainly, James, right, it certainly takes time to carve these very, very nicely carved slate stones like Mary's stone is. So if she died in August of 1774, the stone would probably have been put into here where it is now, probably sometime, I would guess, in 1775. Which was, of course, a year of the year when the war started, right? So feelings would have been running high. and then you see this, perhaps, as James was saying, British style monument, being put in here, that may have caused some tension in the
Yeah.
York village.
So Danny, I know that you've explained to me some of the different headstone features and how they're indicative of earlier versus later. What do you see with this one as far as how it fits into the context of the timeline of the other stone?
Right. Yes. And we were talking about this a little bit earlier. And if you look at the art, at the stone art styles in York's burial ground, you'll note, as James mentioned, the death's head symbol is the dominant symbol, which is the skull with wings on it. And that is on the earliest dated stone in 1705, which was the daughter of the minister Samuel Moody. And the death's head is the dominant symbol all the way through the 1790s. And the last death's head in the burial ground is 1792 is the date, which is about 20 years after this stone here. And then you also, starting in 1747 with Samuel Moody's stone, you have a slightly different image, which is the winged angel image. So similar to the death's head with the wings, but you have a slightly more hopeful looking angel. And those images are present from 1747, but they're somewhat rarer. They're quite a bit rarer than the death's head, which is still the dominant image. So from 1747 through 1774, when you see Mary's stone here, I would say in the burial ground, there's about maybe five, maybe a few more, but still pretty small numbers of these angels.
What about the shape, the outer shape?
Yes, and so so Mary Nasson's stone certainly differs. It's not an angel or the death's head. It would have been the first to break from that. And then you also see the shape of the shoulders is not in the typical rounded shoulder, which is really the only style that you see all the way through the 1790s. Then you start seeing these slightly differently shaped flat shoulders. This is probably the earliest. I can't tell in this image if the shoulders are actually flat. I don't know. I can't, form my mental image. So I don't know if her shoulders are totally flat, but certainly the style is quite different from the
I honestly think for the contemporary town, the stone was pretty shocking.
Yes.
I mean, if you subtract the stones that are of the later 18th century from the burial ground, it increases the contrast of this stone to what would have existed at the same time.
Yep.
And there's almost an indication in his behavior of really acting, in strong opposition to the values of the town.
Wow. That's pretty controversial.
Well, look, I mean, honestly, to be honest with you, it's quite explicit. I mean, even her breasts are exposed.
Yep.
Yeah, and you think this is memorializing a living entity? Like, this isn't a death head. This looks like a living, vivacious person.
Yes.
So that's a total departure from the death heads and stuff. And so do you guys both kind of like agree that this is actually supposed to emulate a living person?
Yes, I think it ties into the mourning aspect. So the death's head and the winged angel, I hold are looking forward to the afterlife. That's the primary purpose of the image there, rather than looking back at the earthly life and the life that was lived on the earth, which is what this stone clearly is. It's a mourning stone. The whole poem that we read out is mourning her earthly life, although there is, of course, the afterlife is still present.
So do you think that, James, do you think that when Samuel came to visit his wife's grave, that he would see a reflection of her in this image?
That's hard to say. I mean, as I said, I think it's more likely the gravestone carver very likely derived this from some contemporary engraving, I would think.
With a little bit more delicacy than his predecessors?
Well, I mean, again, styles of the gravestones, are so reflective of the values of the community.
Yeah. Yeah.
If you go to a community, a contemporary community of New England, and you find by the middle of the 18th century a shift away from the more severe styles, that's reflective of a social change within that community.
Yeah.
It's also reflective of the fact of social status and the relative prosperity of the gravestones that the individuals can afford. I mean, the vast majority of those gravestones in the burial ground of this period are rather on the low end of the scale of quality.
Yes, it's true. I would think, yeah, at the Mary, that's the stone that Samuel ordered for Mary would have been probably one of the stones that, the cost would have been higher, and the quality of the craftsmanship, the carving, is higher than almost every other
And
stone there.
yes, and by that he's making another statement. He's not only making a statement against the values, the conservative values, he's making a statement that is important because even the well-to-do individuals in town, oftentimes adhered to, I mean, look at Jonathan Sayward's wife from the early years of the Revolution. That's a very, very basic death's head style. It's very, very basic style.
And she died in 1775, 1 year after Mary.
Oh, wow. Wow. Yeah.
So Jonathan Sayward is certainly among the wealthiest people in town. So here he is unable to afford a stone, of the quality of the Nasson stone, and there's some indication of status differences there, or what the status differences that Samuel Nasson's tried to represent of himself.
Yeah. And when I think about that in my own family, my father was in charge of taking care of my aunt's funeral expenses, and he just gave her a footstone for a headstone. And I kind of I find it offensive in a lot of ways. And someday I plan to go out there and replace it with something that would justify, and he's buried right next to her, and we gave him this very nice, beautiful granite stone with lavish and so anyway, so I can see Jonathan Sayward he may have just been a cheapskate,
Oh yeah, and he may have been making a moral statement and saying that he was a wealthy man. He could have paid for a fancier stone.
Wow, that's
but he didn't.
Yes, I think the moral statement is part of the value system. Yeah. The conservative values and the moral statement are closely tied together. Samuel Nasson with this stone is basically diverging from that.
Wow. So we have pretty much used up our time that we're expecting to use, and this is great. I love talking to you both, and when I leave, it's like I've just gone through I think I may qualify for a PhD, Danny.
All right.
But I think it's a great time to wrap up, because I'm left feeling like I want to have some more information, and I hope we can do this again soon in the future too. This has been really excellent. And I do want to say to people that I think we could all probably agree, while I'm going to put this out there, that we recommend that everybody supports the historic organizations and we perpetuate history. And how about, could you guys talk to me a little bit about, I know that you're both very interested in authentic primary sourced history and how invaluable that is versus this kind of history that we're seeing happen with Mary Nasson and the visits to the graveyard. Can you tell me a little bit from Danny? Why don't you go first and just tell me why it's so important that people keep history straight and maybe true and honest?
Definitely, yeah. I would say that it's very critical to do that, because the work of sorting through the primary sources is very difficult, and often it's very difficult not only due to the fact that it's hard to find them, which is usually true, but when you have found them, it's also difficult when simply the sources that you are looking for were never made, or the sources that you have found don't tell you the details that you want to actually know. And so in these cases, it's, a natural human, tendency here to start thinking, okay, well, we don't know this, but what could have happened, which is good, and that can certainly help us. But we have to keep it within the bounds of what the primary sources that we do have actually tell us. And if we, go beyond those bounds and just a little bit too wildly, then it can lead to legends and to myths, which are fine on their own. But then when these legends and myths and stories get told as if they are the real history, then I think that does pose problems. And one, not only because they are not the real facts as we know them, but because it covers up and sort of pushes to one side the history that we do know through the primary sources that that people like James, who has been looking through these sources, sometimes very boring sources, for many years to try to find the details that we do know about Samuel Nasson, Mary Nasson, right?
Yeah. James, what do you have to add to that?
Well, I think part of the way we respect the past is to be accurate about it and to be cautious about stereotypes and misconceptions. I think that with historical fiction and all the ways, especially in this era of of media, it's very, very easy to create an oversimplified portrait of the past. And when we do that, we sort of detract from those realities, the harsh realities that really would, if we really had an opportunity to think about them deeply, would cause us to, be somewhat, aware of the distance in time of those individuals living, a couple of hundred years ago from this moment, and recognizing that just in her case, we don't know so much about her, and we certainly don't know the manner of her death, and we don't know the tragic circumstances that might have underlied all of that. And to me, sometimes calling her a witch and making all these types of assumptions about her, who she was in life, without the knowledge that we have, is a form of disrespect.
Yeah, and it's very misguided, and then it's perpetuated, like you said, by the internet. It's kind of like the news cycle now. It's really hard to know what to believe if you just watch all the sound bites and you don't do investigating. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Okay.
I would add one more thing that, going off of what James said, sometimes we have the sort of story that we would like the primary sources to tell, or the story, simply a story that we think should be there that is not there. And then but in the end, we have to go by what the primary sources tell us. And, I'm not just talking about written texts here, which, for most of the history for most of the scholarship, serious scholarship of history, primary sources were meant to be written texts. But now, scholars like James and I certainly take a wider view. We see primary sources are physical objects also. So Mary Nasson stone is a wonderful primary source. But we have to look at it and be satisfied with what it tells us, right? We can't go in with our own notions that we want them to be telling us.
Yeah. Wow. And yeah, that's very interesting. Okay. And so if our viewers have not read James' article in this week's York Weekly, which is today's November 1st, 2020, I recommend that you read it. And James, you actually wanted to make an addendum or an amendment to that article. I know we're probably way out of time here. Can you give me a brief summary of what that?
Well, there were some items that I found in York Deeds and some other sources that provided some further insight into Samuel Nasson and at the time of Mary Nasson's death. Means brief references, for example, in the constable's book, that Widow Beals rented a room in their house in 1773 and 1774, and that just a few years before her death, they obtained a gallery pew in the First Parish Meeting House, and there was a purchase of the house that they had. Just items that really point out a living person,
Yeah.
that is just intended to make people think a little bit about the living person and not the myth.
Yes. Okay. All right, Danny Bottino, James Kences, thank you very much. I've had a great time, and I love learning from you guys. And we'll catch you next time.
Excellent. Thank
Okay.
you.
Very good.
All right.
Yep. Thanks.
Take care.
Oh, I found out what caused the loss of the audio.
Oh, tell us.
The apparently the speaker's cord was disconnected slightly out of the right.
That'll do it every time. For the people that don't know, just before we came on the air, we lost James's, he couldn't hear us. And so he was working through Danny's cell phone. They were working ear to ear.
Yes. All right. Okay.
Okay,
All right.
take care. Thank you.
Have a good evening. Yep. Thanks.
Bye.
Good night.